Good, man. Good. Take a moment to plug yourself and let them know who you are and where to find you.
Yeah, I'm Synth. I debate on the Crucible pretty frequently. You can find me at youtube.com/Synth. It's spelled the same way you see on screen, Sinthe. That's where I do most of my stuff at.
Awesome. Next up, we have Econoboi. Econoboi. Give the same shout out. Let them know who you are and where you're from and where we can find you.
Sure, yeah. So, name's Econoboi. You can find me on youtube.com/Econoboi. Pretty much Econoboi on everything. So, Twitter, YouTube, Twitch, all that stuff. Mostly talk about economics and politics with a tilt towards economics. That's what my education was in. And I guess I'm here to talk to Synth about, market socialism. So, let's do it.
Cool. All right. Econoboi, heads or tails?
Heads or tails? You know what? I'm going to go that it lands right on the middle.
Okay, I gave you tails, so you got it. Tails, you go first with your opening statement, sir. Take your time.
Okay, sure. I don't know if I have much of an opening statement. I guess in regard to market socialism and worker cooperatives broadly, all that I would say is that worker cooperatives are great. Typically, the benefits are not oftentimes overstated by honest actors, right? That seems to be that they have relative survival rates that are pretty good. There could be some selection bias in those studies. Obviously, if you're the type of group of workers to form a cooperative in today's society, which is dominated by traditionally managed firms, then maybe there's some selection bias there. Some things that I think we can definitively say is that they have less turnover rates, which can be a good thing. But other than that, they tend to be about as productive as traditionally managed firms. Some studies say more, some studies say less. Most studies say it kind of depends on the industry and whatnot. There's a lot of definitional problems, especially when you look into studies, and they are meaningful, right? A lot of the studies that people will cite with regard to worker cooperatives are talking about consumer cooperatives. A lot of them are talking about producer cooperatives. A lot of them mix the two together. A lot of them talk about employee stock ownership plans, which companies that are majority owned by employees are not worker cooperatives. Cooperatives typically include sort of an equal either ownership or decision-making capacity per employee. And it's also, there's a distinguisher from there because a lot of cooperatives, not every employee has ownership in a lot of businesses that would label themselves as worker cooperatives, right? So it becomes very muddled. And it can be hard to discern the sort of individual realities of cooperative ownership on the worker side. But especially, I think, when applying it to the macro economy and with regard to market socialism, I think a lot of market socialists have definitions of socialism that I would consider capitalism, right? So if we're allowing for private capital investment with decision-making capacity, if there's firm level inequality within firms, right? So if one employee owns 10% and another employee owns 1%, if there is an ability of the firm to outsource to traditionally managed firms or contract out workers, right, or force workers to gain some sort of tenure to get ownership, I feel like we fall under the same sort of analysis of, oh, this is exploitative and this and that. So it's interesting to talk, I think, in the future of this debate, I should say, about dissent about what that looks like, the transition from capitalism to market socialism, if it would make more sense than the structures that we have now, and to go from there. So I'm really looking forward to it. I guess I should have said from the outset, I'm a capitalist, right? So that's kind of where I'm coming from. I think the Nordic model, been looking into Slovenia, which is interesting, but I think a capitalist system with redistribution and decent enough, worker cooperative encouragement and unionization, I think that's the best system that we know of thus far. And I think market socialism typically either falls short or I would oftentimes consider it capitalism, especially if we get down to the nitty gritty details. So looking forward to it. That's all I've got for my opening statement.
Awesome. Synth, you want to take over?
Sure. So the debate itself, I believe the topic is a cooperative-based economy or a worker co-op-based economy. So if we want to talk about the semantics of what is and isn't socialism, I'd be okay with moving the conversation there as well. But a lot of what I'm going to say is going to have to do with the actual benefits of cooperatives. In Econoboi's opening statement, a couple of things he sort of ceded the territory to me almost immediately. Worker cooperatives are great. They have good survival rates. They're about as productive as traditional firms. And yet, for some reason, under the capital system we have now, we don't see a 50-50 split, despite the fact that they are just as productive, you say. So this must mean that there's some other issue, right? Some other market failure that's causing these things that are equally as productive to not be as common. So I am what's called a market socialist, and in the field of comparative economics, socialism is defined by collective ownership over the factors of production, and capitalism is defined by private ownership over the factors of production. Market socialism is just that collective ownership, but while retaining a market. Obviously, given these definitions of socialism and capitalism, it ends up being, like most things, a spectrum. A country like Norway is a mix of both, but is primarily capitalist. And the system I advocate for would be predominantly socialist. In fact, what I'm advocating for is more socialist than Norway is capitalist. I think it'd be impossible in any society to completely remove private ownership or collective ownership. Obviously, if you still have a black market, I don't think that means your socialist society is no longer socialist. Here's the set of policies I and most other market socialists I've talked to want. I want government to subsidize the creation of new cooperatives, primarily worker co-ops. I want a social wealth fund like Norway's that we can then use to focus companies away from benefits of a small group of shareholders and towards the benefits of society overall. And I want this general set of policies to promote public welfare, just like Econoboi does. Currently, we have a decision theory issue, and it's already causing a lot of real-world negatives. We have the benefit of a small group of the population who, like all people, live for a single generation, put as a priority over our actual goal, which is benefiting all people the most overall. This is a goal that me and you, Econoboi, share. Because of the issues with our society's priorities, we've seen things like global climate change and elites pushing propaganda about it of either, one, it being due to overpopulation, average humans, or two, the idea it's not real at all. We're seeing automation leave people moneyless instead of just leaving them with easier work, and soon, more than likely by 2060, according to most AI researchers, we'll see general AI capable of displacing all jobs and capitalizing on any perverse incentives to a degree never before seen in human history. Capitalism has no long-term solution to the existential crises it keeps creating. It incentivizes not solving issues like these in a timely manner because it doesn't benefit the people currently in control to do so. We have two realistic routes: keeping markets or keeping privatization. Either we reduce markets and retain privatization and become a country like China, which completely sacrifices its civil liberties, its freedom of speech, and its ability to petition the government, or we reduce privatization and retain markets, embracing market socialism, and make America the guiding light to freedom and classical liberal values that people like Thomas Paine and other founding fathers wanted it to be.
Awesome. All right, gentlemen, the floor is open. I'm going to set the clock to 1 hour and 30 minutes. Have at it.
Sure. So Econoboi, if you're okay with me leading the way here, you said that there are a lot of benefits to worker cooperatives and they're just as productive. So given that they're just as productive, if we had cooperatives at about 50% of the current economy, I'm guessing you wouldn't call that socialism.
Well, I think I would take issue with the idea that worker cooperatives could be 50% of the economy. When I say they're just as productive, I mean they're comparatively just as productive in the industries they tend to do well in. Typically, when you look at the studies regarding worker cooperatives, especially on a country level basis, there are three main axes that matter in terms of determining the success of cooperatives. One is, are you actually looking at worker cooperatives? Let's just assume the answer is yes. Two is, what country are you looking at? Three is, what time period you're looking at? And going from, and four would be the industry. And so, I wouldn't call a situation where you've got 50% of the economy privately owned and organized, and the other half is cooperatively organized. I'm not sure I'd call that a socialist economy. And with regard to the productivity, it's on a comparable firm basis. But if the whole economy was cooperatives, there's not necessarily a reason to expect that would be a more efficient or more productive economy, at least based on all the studies that I've seen.
So the position I advocate for isn't to make the entire economy worker cooperatives. The one I've advocated for in the past, and the one I'm advocating for now, is that worker cooperatives should be a large force of the economy, a basis for the economy, and we should also have a social wealth fund as the a huge extra span of the economy, making it almost entirely socialistic, either through the cooperatives, which would be collective, or through the social wealth fund, which is also collective.
Yeah, so I would say that, depending on the policies you're talking about, you've either got market problems or you've not got socialism, right? So you talk about subsidizing cooperatives. Well, I don't think that broadly the government would do well to subsidize a broad class of organization. You probably end up with companies and organizations that aren't as efficient as the otherwise would be, comparable to, a purely more market oriented investment scheme. You'd end up getting businesses that would only exist probably because of the subsidization. That's why I would advocate more so for more organic things, right? Like cooperative loan incentives or lower capital gains tax for businesses that reorganize themselves into worker cooperatives, stuff like that. I mean, the idea of just subsidizing a broad class of corporations seems like you're going to be rife with really centrally planned almost failures that you see of those economies.
So your definition of central planning, I'm guessing, would include then social wealth funds, right? And we don't actually see any of these large-scale issues with those because they still allow the market to do the actual planning.
No, I think you're misunderstanding. When I say it's an issue similar to what you see in central planning, right? Is that when you subsidize a broad class of business, especially in terms of an organization, there's no more hard budget constraints, or they might have subsidies that put them beyond what would be typically available based on market forces. So, for instance, one of the studies that comes out of Portugal finds that, and this was the same study, not the same study, but there's a similar study that came out of France that found that cooperatives are only equally productive or more productive in certain industries, right? And so, if we were to say, hey, every cooperative gets a subsidy on the cost of their inputs, or some sort of preferential tax treatment, or something, whatever you're talking about in terms of subsidies, it really depends. You'd probably end up with a quasi soft budget constraint economy, and you'd probably end up with businesses that weren't quite as productive as they could be otherwise, with an economy characterized more so by hard budget constraints and more softer incentives, either in terms of raising capital or basic accumulation from there.
So you've made the proposition of, instead of doing it through some kind of direct government subsidization, to do it through some kind of like market incentivization of the subsidization coming from like these private investors, through some kind of like incentive for worker cooperatives on that, like in that scale. What kind of incentive are you talking about? What incentive could you give these private investors to make it more likely they're going to invest in worker cooperatives?
Yeah, so for instance, you could enact some sort of a system, and the government's done it before, where you incentivize banks to give out loans to cooperatives, right? So this helps. One of the biggest problems with forming cooperatives is capital, right? A lot of times workers don't have the capital to do it, and a lot of the times on the banking end, they don't necessarily have the knowledge regarding, how do we, what do you call it? Hey Pedro, your mic is you're hot micing like crazy, but I'm
muted actually.
That might be me.
Oh, maybe it's synth. Yeah, someone's sounds like there's a fan in the background or something. But anyway, but I guess I'll try and ignore that. But anyway, the point is that it just went away. Whatever, someone did something.
That was me. I'll just mute myself.
Synth.
You're good.
Automatic 5-point loss synth. You're down.
There we go. But
work at it.
Yeah, but you could incentivize loans to be formed, which allows you to sort of privately and by the market deliver capital in the form of loans to cooperatives that want to be formed. And then from there, you could also give 0% capital gains tax to owners that sell their business to workers, right? These would be organic ways to form cooperatives. For instance, typically the cooperatives that are formed in America don't they don't sprout out of the ground organically. They tend to be conversions. And so incentivizing that type of thing would I think, help sort cooperatives. And this is the key, I think, is that you want to effectively sort cooperatives into the industries that they do the best in, right? And I think a broad subsidization wouldn't do that.
So the things you just listed off would all just be indirect subsidizations. So I'm not really sure why you. This is obviously it might just be a semantic dispute, and I don't really care too much to delve into it. But in the case of what you just advocated for, it is a subsidy. I'm fine with using this subsidy, so long as it does increase the amount of cooperatives in society to the point where they can be considered the foundation, I guess, of sort of like how we distribute consumer goods. When it comes to the rest of the economy, I think social wealth funds are really, really good for filling those out as well. And I think you'd agree, or at least I would think you would agree, when it comes to a society which is entirely, or not entirely, but very, very much predominantly cooperatives and social wealth funds, maybe 80% of the economy, right? I think we could both agree that this is the kind of thing that would qualify as socialism, right?
I really think you'd have to contend, I think, with the socialists in that regard. I think that there are some socialists who might say that any amounts of private organization and investment could be not considered socialism. I'm not really sure, and I'm not sure I care to have that debate. But I would just push back on the idea that the economy is going to be 80% social. Like, I don't even know what you mean by 80% social wealth fund, and then including the cooperative.
No, I didn't. Maybe I misspoke. I don't think I said that. The point is 80% of it would be either social wealth funds or cooperatives. It wouldn't really matter which one it is specifically, so long as it's those two things. I think it might be like an even mix of both, maybe 40-40. I don't see any reason why that wouldn't be socialistic. I think maybe you could use like the Marxist definition of socialism, but socialism predates that by a long shot.
Yeah, I mean, that's whatever. I think I would just contend with the idea that that would be possible. I mean, even in in societies that are the most dominated societies by worker cooperatives, I don't even think come close to that sort of organization, right? And these are societies that don't necessarily have the same barriers to entry and have the same sort of incentivizations that we might both agree are positive, right? And I think that under those types of systems, if you still don't see a lot of organic formation of cooperatives, it probably means one of two things. It either means, one, workers for some reason prefer not to form their own cooperatives, or it might mean, and there's probably a give and take between these two, that worker cooperatives just don't broadly have an ability to, form in the economy, right? That, maybe you do well to get 10, 15, 20% of the economy to be cooperatively owned. And by that, I mean worker cooperatively owned, but the prospect of 50, 60%, I mean, it just doesn't seem like that's bore out, even in countries where they have...
Well, 50-60% would both be higher than what I advocated for, which was 40-40, right? So 40% about work cooperatives, 40% about social wealth funds. This alone would give us a very, very predominantly socialistic society. This fits any reasonable definition of market socialist. I think the average market socialist agrees with this policy. You can take a look at specific examples of certain places where it's already like about a third of the GDP of certain places. So like... Yeah, so when we say cooperatives, if we're talking cooperatives generally, we have like 10% of cooperatives, or 10% of the US is cooperative. 10% of the GDP of Emilia-Romagna is cooperative. Worker cooperatives specifically are going to be a smaller scale of those, though.
No, you're totally wrong about this. So, I mean, 10% of the US is not cooperatively owned and organized. I just have no idea where you're getting that idea. When we're talking about cooperatives, we're talking about worker cooperatives. I'm sure you're able to find a lot of farming cooperatives, which are producer cooperatives, not worker cooperatives. I'm sure you're able to find in the US even some employee stock ownership companies. For instance, I think there's a big grocery store chain in the Pacific Northwest. I think that's like the biggest example of a majority-owned company.
I clarified pretty explicitly. I'm talking about cooperatives broadly. So not specifically worker cooperatives, but cooperatives broadly do exist about 10% of the US economy. Right. When it comes to Emilia-Romagna, it is 30% of theirs, right? So obviously I agree. Worker cooperatives are a different thing than cooperatives in general. But we can see if there is the case that like producer and consumer cooperatives and things like this, usually consumer cooperatives, are able to function on this large scale and these places where they are subsidized, then the same could be true for worker cooperatives. I don't see why it's that unrealistic.
It's not that wouldn't be unrealistic, but if we broaden the definition of cooperative to include consumer and producer cooperatives, I would absolutely take issue with your definition of socialism. Producer cooperatives and consumer cooperatives...
Maybe you misheard my point. I'm not saying these are worker cooperatives. I'm saying these are a form of cooperatives, and when subsidized, they are able to become very large. So this other form of cooperative, if subsidized, could also become very large.
No, I disagree. I don't think you can cross apply those two things, right? I mean, when we look at those situations, right, where take Uruguay or take Italy, where they've sort of incentivized by government policy the formation of cooperatives. Now, to be fair, I'm not sure entirely about the producer cooperatives or the consumer cooperatives of Uruguay, but when we look at Italy, we talk about that one region of northern Italy that's 30 or 40% cooperatively organized. It's only 5 or 10% of that, if I'm not mistaken, that's worker cooperatives. And so my point is that in a society where you've got sort of a broad incentivization of cooperatives to organically form and sort themselves out in the industries that they do best in, under the types of organizations that they might do best in, you do not see worker cooperatives becoming even anywhere close to 40% of the economy. They don't do that well, right? Now, they do well in the things that they do well in, right? They can sort themselves and be advantageous in those industries, but I don't think that under your society you'd ever, and there's no empirical demonstration I think that you can provide that shows that when the government provides a soft subsidy, provides some sort of incentives, and not some sort of hard incentive or requirement, you cannot find me a system where you've come anywhere even close to that. And I think
Wait, are you asking for you're asking for empirical data on the future?
No. I'm not asking really for anything, but you're trying to cite. I think a lot of socialists
you definitely did. You just said that, like, I can't provide you with empirical data on this thing about a statement about the future. Like, yeah, neither can you.
Well, no. The difference is I don't have to look in the future. I can look at today, right? So here's what I'm trying to say is that
you can look at today to see that worker cooperatives aren't going to be successful if incentivized.
Right. So we've already had in across the world, we've had systems that have broadly incentivized cooperative organization, right? And I think you would agree with that. Now, what you did before is what a lot of socialists will do, market socialists, I should say, which is to say, same thing with all these guys. Look at this region of northern Italy that's 30 or 40% worker cooperatives. Clearly, incentives work. Well, yeah, but you aren't advocating for consumer or producer cooperatives. I'm not sure you'd consider those socialism. That's a different conversation. It seems we're talking about worker cooperatives, right? And in society,
to correct you, I explicitly in the opening statement advocated for all forms of cooperatives, and worker cooperatives I think are especially good.
Well, okay. Well, then I guess we can move on to the others, to that debate, after I'm done with this statement, which is just to say that in societies that broadly incentivize cooperative organization, you do not see worker cooperatives become a predominant form of organization. Now, they're a significant portion of organization in those economies, but if you're advocating for saying, hey, 40% of the economy being a mixture, say a third of producer-consumer, worker cooperatives, and then 40% being a social welcome, that's socialism. I just don't think that's reasonable, right? Consumer cooperatives and producer cooperatives, I don't think under most frameworks would be considered a socialist form of organization. The workers don't own the means of production.
So workers owning the means of production is not the definition any econ textbook is ever going to give you for socialism. That's the Marxist idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Even they don't consider that socialism. Socialism itself is collective ownership of the means of production.
Well, sure. So what you would say is that if a society is predominantly, say it's 1/3 of the 40%, so maybe 12% each, 13% each of worker, consumer, producer cooperatives. And then you've got a social wealth fund, I guess, not crossing over to that cooperative segment, but then the private segment, of the 60% of the economy left, you've got 2/3 of it that's owned under a social wealth fund. And then you've got 1/3 that's privately organized. You would call that socialism.
You've just given me an example of a predominantly collectively organized society.
Okay, so if that's your...
That would be a mostly socialist society, right?
Well, if your understanding of socialism is like a sort of nebulous sort of collective ownership of the means of production, would you consider societies like, say societies like China or societies like the Soviet Union, would these be socialist economies?
So I think in the examples of the Soviet Union, they had a large free market and private ownership. I think in the case of China, this is also true as well. I wouldn't consider those collectively owned.
Why not, though?
Because the ownership isn't collectivized. It's in the hands of a small few individuals who don't necessarily represent the society as a whole.
I see. So you have to operate under a broadly democratic framework, I suppose, for any society. Even if it's centrally planned, you wouldn't call that collective ownership because it's not democratic.
If there was a democratic election of like technocrats or something, that would be collective ownership.
Well, is that not? That's how China, Cuba, Soviet Union.
No, China's not democratic. No, it is not.
So I'm just confused what you mean by democracy. So in China and Cuba and in the Soviet Union, they have internal party competition, might say technocratic competition, right? And so under that definition, why aren't they socialist? I mean, I'm not saying China's a democracy, for God's sake, but...
Yeah, so China is not a democracy, like you admit, right? The way that China functions in terms of their government, yeah, you're not able to run if you're outside their party, right? So it is a single party state. This isn't democratic. This doesn't have democratic competition. This wouldn't be collective in any way because it's the hands of a small few individuals. You may as well start saying that shareholders are collective ownership if China is.
Yeah, I guess that's kind of my point. I think your definition of socialism is a little weird. You mentioned that technocratic democracy would be considered, good enough.
I mean, this isn't this isn't my definition of socialism. This is the definition that I could, like, if you want to grab like comparative economics in a changing world economy or something, go to like the first paragraph on socialism. It's going to say the exact same definition I do.
No, I understand. I'm not arguing. I'm asking you to explain it. When you say technocratic democracy, what do you mean? Like limiting only educated people can vote or something? Or what does that mean?
No, I mean like having representatives who are experts. I think this is a fine way to do a representative democracy. I think in the U.S., we have something that's representative. I think the representative democracy in general is a fine way to organize society.
All right, guys. One moment. Just take a mental pen on that. Sorry, Econoboi. There's no fair way to cut you off, but I gotta read this super chat because we love when people support us. Thank you so much, David, for your $10. How does the mob mentality / groupthink affect the operation of co-ops, where an individual is more likely to conform to the group against their better judgment?
Yeah, I mean, I guess my response to that is, you can make a similar criticism of democratic systems broadly, and I'm not sure it's really a fair criticism of democracy in general. To me, that's I don't know. That's not a criticism of cooperatives that I would, take that seriously. I don't think, especially because I assume in any market socialist system, there would probably be regulations on like, secret balloting and, no retribution and stuff like that. But, I guess Synth might be able to shed some more light on that.
Sure. So in the case of your question, I think that when we talk about mob mentality, yeah, we can see people who operate in sort of like a who go with the group when it's not necessarily in their best interest to do so. It's even more so the case in like capitalistic systems, right? So if we watch how people like decide what stocks they're going to buy, you can watch people do this based entirely on who else is doing it, because that functionally actually works well. It provides good results sometimes. Not always, but sometimes it does, right? Any criticism like this used against cooperatives would be more true of a capitalist system.
All right. I guess moving on from the talk of democracy, I think that there's still an issue. So would you consider, do you think an economy with a predominance of producer cooperatives would be considered a socialist economy?
I wouldn't say so. I think producer cooperatives are well, I wouldn't say necessarily so, right? Obviously, it could be the case, but I think producer cooperatives are very, they're positive. They seem to do actually good, and they have good results. But I think consumer cooperatives seem to be much better at actually collectivizing things. And if you take a look at places with very large cooperative sectors, they're usually very, very, very much consumer cooperatives. The U.S. is the case for this.
Okay, and what is the, say that we've gotten to the system, I think there's issues with what you just said, because I think that at least when it comes to the region of northern Italy, when it comes to the U.S., and especially when it comes to the U.S., the predominance of like cooperative organization tends to be producer cooperatives. But I guess if you don't consider those socialism, it seems like we agree, and we might just quibble over the actual proportion of the economy that would end up being producer cooperatives. If that was the case, but when it comes to your end goal, right? So say we've got this economy, somehow, some way, we've made it the case. 40% of the economy is social wealth fund, sort of, you could say owned. And then 40% of the economy is some proportion of producer, consumer and worker cooperatives. And then the other 20% is just totally privately run and organized. Is that the end goal, or do you have goals beyond that?
Sure. So if you're asking, do I have goals beyond like a very predominantly socialist society? My goal is to do whatever makes society the best overall for the most amount of people. If it's the case that this is the best we can do, just market socialism, then that sounds fine to me. I don't really have any like further goals after that. I'm not like a Marxist who thinks this is just a temporary stepping stone to something else. I'm just a market socialist. Sounds like you are too, honestly.
I'm definitely not a market socialist, because I don't really consider your economy to be socialism. I don't think it's possible to organize it that way. But when it comes
given the definition I've given for market socialist, it seems like would you say that you fit that?
A society that is where the means of production are collectively owned.
This would be what a market socialist advocates for.
Well, you didn't answer my question. So is market socialism a society where the means of production are collectively owned?
I did. I said this is what a market socialist advocates for.
Oh, I see. Yeah, well, if that's the case, then I wouldn't call that market socialism, because you've still got 20% of the economy that's not collectively owned or operated. So
you claimed I didn't answer your question. I did. You haven't answered my question, right? So I asked you, what I asked you was, given the definition I have for market socialism, would you fit that?
No, clearly not, because the society that you describe and the society that I would want would not be a collectively owned society, right? You'd still have 20% of the economy that has the sort of Marxian exploitation that I assume you'd argue against. I mean, how do you justify that?
I'm not a Marxist, so I don't. What are you talking about?
So why get rid of the sort of capital relationship in the economy? Why would you argue that that's a good thing to do? Or would you argue that's a good thing to do?
I told you in the opening statement that I think that there's a decision theory issue with making sure that the society that we live in is one that benefits like a very small group of individuals. The examples we've seen of this in the real world, where that's like bared on, that's been shown to actually have like pretty negative consequences, has been climate change. In the past, we've seen other examples of this, like the crumbling ozone layer, which we managed to fix. And I think in the future, it seems like, according to most AI researchers, we'll see general AI as an issue with this. Existential crises are something that capitalism seems to create pretty frequently.
And so you would say that your society, where capitalism is sort of shunned to only 20% of the economy, wouldn't create these same sort of issues?
If these issues began to exist, we'd be able to deal with them much faster under a socialized system.
How so?
Sure. So when it comes to the ways in which we've seen like climate change denial propagated really widely, I think it seems that there's a small group of individuals who benefit the most from this. We know that the rich are disproportionately the cause of climate change here in the U.S. If we take a look at that, it seems clear to me that the motivation for why we're seeing climate change denial is some kind of top-down propaganda. We actually see very large amounts of money going into climate change denial. This alone, I think, is enough to show there is like a difference in preferences between this small elite group and their interest and the interest of society overall.
Right. Well, why would your society prevent the formation of this same type of power structure, right? I mean, you've got 20% of the economy that's purely capitalist organized, and then you've got a broader 60% of the society that is privately organized, just happens to be owned by a social wealth fund, which of course might not have the most effect. But why would that society not be susceptible to these same sort of power relations that you'd argue against?
Sure. So if your society is owned by a social wealth fund, obviously the responsibility of your company is to make sure that the preferences of the people who own that social wealth fund are being met as much as possible. This is the way that you're going to keep your company afloat. In the same way, they're making sure the preferences of your shareholders are being increased as much as possible, is the case for a privately owned business. I think in this case, we sort of see that the benefits of society overall would be more than likely not denying climate change.
So I'm confused by that. I guess I'm not sure where to go with this. How does a social wealth fund create a structure where people don't deny climate change?
Sure. So the interests of society overall are not in favor of denying climate change, right?
Right. I'm not a climate change denier, sure.
No, I didn't say you were. So if the interests of society overall are not in favor of denying climate change, then it would make sense, right, that if we want to do what's best for society overall, it would make sense to not deny climate change. If the reason why we have, if our social wealth fund is being owned collectively by society as a whole, and we're owned by that social wealth fund, it would make sense that we'd want to do what benefits the owners of that social wealth fund, right?
Well, you're not explaining how does a social wealth fund?
Okay. Is this something you dispute? I thought that was like pretty. I just have to know if you're actually like this is something you disagree with, so I can like follow along the line of logic.
I'm not sure what you mean. What do you mean disagree with? I'm not. Again,
do you think the thing I just said was wrong?
No. Again, I'm not a climate denier. I think the idea that a society believes that climate change is a good thing, right? What I'm asking is so you've got 60% of the economy that's privately run and organized, and 40% of that 60% is owned by a social wealth fund. Okay, we get that, right? Now, how does that structure prevent a broad denial of climate change?
Sure. So the ownership of the social wealth fund in particular would prevent that denial because it's owned collectively, and thus the benefit or the benefit of society collectively is going to be what you're trying to do, like what you're trying to maximize, as opposed to the benefit of a small elite group. You said you agreed with that just now. So that alone shows what the social wealth fund would be would contribute to that. In the case of the cooperatives, obviously this is once again going to be owned collectively, and thus there's some kind of collective benefit to your employees overall, which is going to benefit society the most, or that's going to be the interest of your organization. You understand this. I don't think you disagree with that one. In the case of the 20% that is still privately owned, obviously their interest would be different than the rest of society, but they wouldn't have nearly the same kind of vast control over society they do now. So it would go from like 100% or almost 100%. Obviously, it's closer to 90%, I think, and bound down to a level of about 20%. So I don't see why this doesn't seem to you to be an explanation.
Yeah, I guess again, if people wanted to deny climate change, I'm not sure the government owning a third of the economy in a social wealth fund would cause any change in that. When we're talking about the issues of regulating pollution or sort of stemming climate change, a lot of the issues are localized in nature, right? So whether the coal company is a cooperative or a privately organized firm owned by a conglomerate, they're still incentivized to continue producing coal and polluting the environment because, one, it's profitable for them to do so, whether they're worker owners or whether not, and two, it's the pollution that they experience is spread out across the vast portion of society, right? So they don't directly experience the cost of their actions, right? And whether it's a social wealth fund owning them, a conglomerate, an individual person, or the workers collectively. So the structure doesn't make sense to me as a means to solve climate change. You need government involvement, government regulation to do that sort of thing.
So a social wealth fund would necessarily entail government regulation. Who owns the social wealth fund?
So a social wealth fund would obviously be owned by the government, right? And
exactly. And so who's regulating the social wealth fund?
What do you mean by regulation, though? Like the government is like telling the social wealth fund, you can't make these investments, you have to make these investments. How does that work?
Who appoints if a social wealth fund owns your business, who appoints the board of directors?
Well, it depends on what portion of your business is owned by the social wealth fund.
The entirety of it.
Yeah, if your company is sort of almost like the Chinese economy where you've got your only owner is the government, that's one thing. You'd have to have
so who appoints the board of directors in these cases?
So in the case, yes, where your company is owned entirely by the government social wealth fund, then you would appoint the board of directors. But I think you run into problems in that regard.
And so if you appoint, so then the regulation of this company would be done by the government, right?
The oversight of the company would be done by the government, not the regulation.
What is your difference?
Obviously,
what is your difference? What do you think the word regulation means?
Okay, so a board of what does a board of directors do?
Can you answer my question first?
What do you? I'm trying to get.
The question was, what is the definition for the word regulation that you're using?
So the distinction that I would draw is regulations are sort of mandates from the government to private operators, right? What you're talking about is from the board side to the company side. It's totally internal, right? So now to my question, right? What does a board of directors do?
How is it entirely internal?
A board of directors is per the company, right? The company is
per the company. Who appoints them? An external body. So it's not entirely internal.
No. The board is internal, right? Shareholders are sort of external actors to the company, right? But when we're talking about at the point.
So in that same sense, any regulation is internal by that same definition because the company follows it internally after being regulated externally.
Okay, so let's say you've got a country like Norway, right? Obviously an oil-rich country. They have a social wealth fund, they have a nationalized oil company, or they have a national oil company, I should say, right? Now, they've taken their sort of wealth from their oil, and they've done good things with it, right? They've electrified their economy to a great extent and gone from there. Now, at the same time, they're still drilling and pumping oil out of the ground, right? They're still contributing to the pollution of the earth, right? So it doesn't seem like this structure that you're advocating for has prevented broadly the mindset of pollution in the economy, right?
Yeah, so Norway's social wealth fund doesn't own businesses in Norway. 0 businesses in Norway are owned by the main social wealth fund that we're talking about when we say Norway's social wealth fund. They have a very small one that owns very small portions of Norway's economy, but their big social wealth fund owns none of Norway. It doesn't own a single business in Norway. So it wouldn't have any effect on Norway's it's almost strange because if it was the case, then even then you'd still be wrong because Norway's carbon emissions are some of the lowest in the world per capita when we talk about first world countries. So it's like 2 layers of wrong.
Well, I mean, at least from what I've read, that about a third of the sort of public equity in Norway is owned by the social wealth fund. I may have been reading an incorrect stat or something like that, but
they are dispermitted by law from investing in themselves with their social wealth fund, their primary social wealth fund. They have another very small one, which is able to invest in Norway. It is not a third of the size of their larger one. I guess it would have to be half the size.
Well, yeah. There's 2 social wealth funds. There's the pension fund and then the general social wealth fund, right? When we're talking about the oil company, though, right? This is a national oil company, right? And again, they haven't really done any of the sort of environmental things that you're talking about, right?
You're talking about Norway's. You think Norway is doing poor in terms of their environmental impact?
No. I don't think you're listening to what I'm saying. Okay. Norway,
maybe I misheard you. That could be on my
national oil company, Norway, regulated, overseen by the government. Okay, they have not had the incentive structure to have their oil company reduce their pollution. They might be a relatively environmentally friendly oil company, right? However, they are still an oil company extracting resources from the ground, causing a lot of carbon pollution. Now, my point is that if you had a situation, say, outside of the Norwegian social wealth fund structure, we might be reading different stats on it. Say that you had a social wealth fund that owns a bunch of mineral and resource extraction companies, right? Which, to be fair, would be the case with the broad number of countries in the world. It does not seem that would create a structure that is necessarily environmentally friendly. You would need some sort of external push or exogenous regulation from there. The structure itself doesn't solve the issue.
Yeah, I did a quick fact check. No, Equinor is, if this is the one you're talking about in particular, the state-owned oil company in Norway. They have a tremendous amount of investment in renewable energy sources. So if this is your example of how it doesn't work, how it doesn't produce green infrastructure, no, it kind of is.
Yeah, Shell and Exxon own and invest a tremendous amount of money into renewable resources, right? That doesn't mean that the predominance of the business by any means is renewable focused, right? That would be the idea. I don't think that's a really good example.
A business is not going to convert to renewable focus just because it's in the interest of society overall to be renewable focused. In the case of the business, it also has to make sure that it's making some kind of money. In the case of a business that's like societally owned, it's the case that it's more likely to be more in favor of these renewable technologies as opposed to doing something that's disastrous and destroys the planet. In the case of Norway, they are very, very, very green. I don't know why you would use Norway as your example of like this climate disaster of a nation.
No, because you're making the point that a social wealth fund would lead necessarily to a society at a business level or an aggregate level becoming more green, right? Now, it seems that we disagree. Well, hold on, right? So it seems that we disagree on some of the facts, right? You can look at Shell, you can look at Exxon, and you'll find that they invest billions of dollars in renewable resources, right? You might find Equinor does the same thing. But the point is they operate under totally different governing structures, right? You can obviously look at the predominance of oil companies and national oil companies that don't do those same investments, right? So my only point is that if we care about the environment, it doesn't appear that a socialist mode of production would necessarily solve for the environmental calamities that face us. We need some sort of ground level movement or government regulation beyond that.
Okay. Maybe I misheard you. Did you say Shell and Exxon were investing billions of dollars into renewable energy? Could you tell me how many billions?
I couldn't tell you the exact number. I know it's in the billions. I mean, I don't have their balance sheets in front of me, but it's quite a shitload of money. But so I'm not able to find anything that shows that they're investing billions. But I'm just like I'll take your word for it. Well, sure. Yeah, that's my only point, is that when we look at the idea of climate change as an issue, the incentives to pollute and emit on the government side or on the company side don't seem to be solved by either the workers owning the companies, the consumers owning the companies, the producers owning the companies, or the company being owned under a social wealth fund. That's how much
of Shell or Exxon's R&D is going towards renewables? Did you know offhand?
I think that in terms of renewable development, I want to say that Shell was the last company that I saw in this regard. Depending on who you ask and depending on what you believe, it's between 1 and 5 billion, which is anywhere from, I think, 5 to 15% of their R&D that's towards renewables.
That's a lot. In the case of Equinor, it's 25% though, so that's a lot more. So I guess that was
you're going to go with that? No.
25 is ridiculous. Yeah, I'm going to go with that. You just said something. Your entire line of argumentation was the opposite of the truth.
Right. So you have to demonstrate to me. First of all, Norway is not a socialist economy. Again, you're using this as an example, but Norway is not. No.
You forgot. You were using this as an example. You brought that example up. Your example was a counterexample to your position.
To demonstrate the idea that just because a company might be a nationally owned company, that they're not necessarily going to, invest in renewable energy. I mean, Norway, to be fair, is your best example. right? When we talk about the Saudi Arabian National Oil Company or the Mexican National Oil Company, you're not going to find anything nearly to that favor, right? It seems to me that the socialist mode of production doesn't necessarily solve for, the environment. You need external regulation. You need something more than that, to solve for the environment. Right?
So you once again called it my best example, just to really, really hit this home. You brought this specific example up. You thought this was an example in your favor. I have no idea. Yeah, I have no idea what the R&D funding of these of Mexico's national oil company is. I have no clue. And I wouldn't be surprised if it was more than 5%.
You wouldn't be surprised if it was more than 5%. Oh, you're talking about the Mexican R&D.
Guys, just to chime in for a moment, we do hear things here a little differently. And on the Shell and Exxon thing about investing billions of dollars into renewable energy, I've been looking at for at least the past 3 minutes, and I got nothing on it. So, Econoboi, do you have anything you can send over so we can put in the chat and actually support that claim?
Yeah, sure. I'll try and find it maybe during Q&A. It's hard to do it during the live discussion, but
I hear you. Well, just we try and do that to clarify if that make claims here actually true that.
Yeah, sure. No problem. I'll try and find it. But anyway, yeah, I just in general, I don't think that it's the case that just because the workers, producers, consumers, or a social wealth fund owns some portion of the world economy, that you'd end up finding that economy is necessarily more green, right? I bring up Norway as an example where they have done good work in that regard, but it's not necessarily the case that they would. If that were the case, we would expect countries like China or the former Soviet Union to be some of the greener economies in the world, and that doesn't seem to be the case.
It does seem to be the case. I'm not a big fan of China, but the reason I'm not a big fan of China is not because of their policy in regards to things like climate change. It's because of their policy in regards to things like civil liberties. In regards to climate change, they are one of the greenest economies in the world. Their per capita emissions are very low. They built a tremendous amount of nuclear reactors. They are continuing to build more, and they started building them far before any other country really got wind of that. And started doing the same. France is another good example of a country with a lot of renewable energy and non-renewable nuclear reactors, all of which reduce carbon emissions by a tremendous amount. If China is your example of a country that isn't going green, that's an awful example. They're a bad country for a lot of reasons. Their environmental impact is not one of them.
Yeah, I think the idea that China has a negligible environmental impact or an improving environmental impact is definitely wrong. I mean, again, if we look at like per capita emissions of China, we might say that it's relatively low compared to the most developed economies in the world, the United States, the UK, Canada, stuff like that. But that's also because China is a broadly much poorer country than the United States. Of course, they're making big strides in that regard, right? But if we're going to say that the Chinese economy is more environmentally friendly broadly, or that they're making good strides in that regard, I think some of that's true. Obviously, the Chinese economy is investing a lot of money into renewables and the thorium reactors and nuclear energy and stuff like that. But I think since the year 2000 or so, the aggregate amount of emissions from the U.S. and the EU have been going down. Per capita emissions have been going down for I think quite a long time before that as well. So again, the idea that more government ownership necessarily means, more better for the environment doesn't seem to be true. I could say the same thing about India, right? I mean, India has a lot less per capita emissions than China does. Would I say India is an environmentally friendly economy? I mean, probably not.
Would you say that India is doing a tremendous amount to invest in nuclear reactors? Have they increased nuclear reactors more than any other country since 2011? I don't think so. I think in China's case, it's pretty crystal clear that in the case of China, they have done a lot in terms of their actual environmental impact. The bad aspects of China are going to be their civil liberties. You should focus on that if you want to talk about China, not the fact that they are bad on the environment. They're doing a tremendous amount.
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm not disagreeing with the nominal amount of investment that China has done in regard to, renewable energy or, nuclear energy, right? What I'm disagreeing with is your original statement that China is a good example of one of the most environmentally friendly countries in the world. Right? That is an absurd statement on its face.
Firstly, you were the one who brought up China. Once again, you've failed to track.
Wait.
In the case of China,
no. Stop.
Yeah,
I'm not gonna.
Yeah, you did. Yeah, you did.
No, I'm not going to take that. No. I brought up China, yes.
Okay.
You were the one that made the claim that China is one of the most environmentally friendly countries in the world. This is in the case of statement.
No, it isn't. They are building more Can you name any country that has more nuclear reactors currently under construction than China? Just one.
More nuclear reactors? They have 1.4 billion people. Of course, they probably have the most of many things. That doesn't
what about
mean
per
they're
capita?
Environmentally friendly.
Can you name one that has more per capita?
Per capita nuclear reactors? I'm not sure such a stat has been tracked. To be honest,
if you have the amount of nuclear reactors, you have the population. It's very easy to do a division problem and find out per capita.
If I had
that's
to,
tracked.
But that doesn't matter. What matters is the actual production of power from those plants. And if I had to guess, the country that probably does the best per capita in terms of nuclear energy power production, if I had to guess, this is a guess, probably France. If I'm not mistaken, I think about 70-80% of their grid is nuclear energy, and that is you might disagree with it. That's a capitalist economy, right? So again, I think the idea that China is one of the most environmentally friendly, compared to Norway, compared to the US, the most environmentally friendly countries in the world seems pretty absurd, considering it was like 3 months ago that they said they'd stop investing in coal plants. I think 2/3 of their power comes from coal. This is not an environmentally friendly country broadly.
What do you attribute with the reason France has so many nuclear reactors?
From my understanding of the history of France's grid, and I have looked into it, it has to do with two things. Well, I suppose really the same thing. It's basically good government planning.
Yeah. Your one example of a thing that you said was a capitalist country, right, is once again a case where government planning is responsible for why they're more green.
Is government planning socialism?
So socialization is socialism, right? Or socialization past a certain point would be a socialist economy.
Answer my question?
I did. The answer is no, this other thing is, right? So that's just implied.
Right. So if government planning is not socialism, I'm not sure reasonably we can say every time a government does a good thing that it is an example of socialist organization being advantageous.
You were saying that the reason that the reason why something like China is better in terms of their energy production than other countries is because of some factor outside of the government involvement in China's economy. That's why we brought up China. China isn't a socialist country either.
Right. That's exactly what I'm saying. You said that collective ownership of the means of production, or like government involvement, necessarily entails that
government involvement. Yes, like France.
Right. So are we also saying that 2/3 of the grid being powered by coal is also government involvement, and that's the reason? I mean, we probably wouldn't say that, right? There's many other factors that would go into that calculation, right? You're taking a very absolutist stance, right? Which seems to be that, and of course, correct me if I'm wrong, the idea that more government involvement in the economy, or perhaps an energy policy, necessarily means a more environmentally friendly policy. Now, I don't necessarily disagree with the idea that you need government involvement and regulation in order to make the environment greener and more sustainable, but I wouldn't consider government involvement socialism, and I wouldn't consider it necessarily collective ownership.
Sure. So I agree. It's not necessarily socialism, but if government involvement is leading to this thing, then it shows that there's some kind of like government ownership over the means of production does end up leading to more green practices over time. I'm not saying it's a necessary condition. I'm not saying that this is something that necessarily shows this is the case. I'm saying there's a link between these two things. And if we want to promote good outcomes, doing this thing can promote good outcomes.
Sure. I guess it turns out that after all of that, we don't necessarily have a lot of disagreement in that regard. I mean, my view on environmental regulation would just be generally that capitalism can solve a little bit, I would say, like private organization and markets, of course, contribute a lot to the climate transition. Obviously, private investment in renewable energies and stuff is a good thing. That's a big thing that does exist, and it does help transform the grid. But broadly, things, incentivizations, subsidizations, perhaps national ownership. Obviously, I'm not sure I'm on board with like the idea of a national power industry or something like that. But I think that's a good thing. I really felt like I had to push back on the idea that China is one of the most environmentally friendly countries in the world. I mean,
one second. I have to be fair here. I researched the claim that Synth made on the screen I'm posting. He was, in fact, correct on the most reactors being constructed being in China right now. I also posted the link in chat. So
and to be fair, and to be doubly fair, I didn't disagree with that, right? I'm not surprised to hear that China is producing the most nuclear reactors. They're the biggest country, right? I mean, it doesn't really surprise me.
By what?
By population, if I'm not mistaken. I think they're the biggest country. Could be wrong.
You might be correct on that. I'm not sure if India's overpassed them yet or not. I'll just take that as granted. But in the case of something like India, we see as a very similar population size, not nearly as many nuclear reactors. Your example of France, actually, I did a little bit of fact checking. In the case of France, they actually have a public sector workforce above China's in terms of their size. 25% of their workforce is public sector. So in their case, they are a highly socialistic economy, though I would agree, primarily capitalist. But once again, highly socialistic.
I'm still confused by your definition of socialism, and this could be just a huge miscommunication. Again, is having a huge public sector like government employees, does that make a country socialist in your mind? That's what I'm confused about. Your definition of socialist seems to be very nebulous.
No, the definition of socialism is not nebulous, it's just a spectrum, right? So there's a difference between these two things. So things can be like a sliding scale, and we can still have something like a fixed point on which we called like a thing sufficiently socialist to be like true socialism or something, right? I don't think 100% is going to be that line.
100% of what, though? That's kind of the question.
Sure. So we could say that it's 100% of the economy overall. Obviously, that this is like we can dig down into like what this means. I think the GDP is a fine way to measure this. I think showing something like the size of the workforce would also be a fine way to measure this. Because obviously, in the case of the GDP, that shows like where the control over the economy is. And in the case of something like the workforce, this shows how people live their daily lives. Either of these, I think, would be fine measurements. We could go with whichever one you prefer, if you'd like. Whichever one makes your case stronger.
Okay, so again, it sounds like I may be just mishearing or misunderstanding. So again, it sounds like government running of things and public production, like government production, does in fact contribute to your ability to be considered socialist, I guess.
So long as it's some kind of collective ownership. It could be collective through the state, or it could be collective through some outside of the state force. It could be in the hands of the state, but not collective, and that wouldn't be socialist.
Okay, so draw the line for me. How does a state ownership, when does it become collective? When is it not collective?
Sure. So in the case of a state that's not democratically controlled, one that's privately controlled or controlled by a small elite group, I wouldn't consider this to be an example of a collective state. That's the line.
Okay, a democratic government is the line, basically.
Yeah, obviously even that's a spectrum, right? Highly democratic governments would be, if they own the entirety of the economy, it'd be a highly socialistic one, whereas a somewhat democratic economy would be a somewhat socialistic one.
Okay, so France, you would consider a more socialist country than China?
I'm not necessarily sure.
Okay, well, I guess let's avoid that. Maybe Norway would be considered a more socialist country than China.
More than likely.
Okay, I guess that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I don't know where we could go from here. Maybe change the topic. I guess I just feel like the idea that, to me, I feel like it's sort of almost bimodal, right? That there's probably some overlap. We can quibble over the percentage of the economy that's owned by this or that, but I feel like an economy that 60% of it's privately organized, maybe 2/3 of that is owned under a social wealth fund. Apparently, there's not many empirical examples of a social wealth fund that owns that large a section of the economy, I suppose, because you mentioned...
There'd be one that owns a very large amount of economies overall, right? So when we talk about like Norway's social wealth fund, it's a tremendously large amount.
No, it is. I understand, but it appears we're looking internally with social wealth funds under your view, right? That the social wealth fund would own 40% of the economy within that nation. And that's a lot different, and I feel like it makes it a bit harder to use those empirical examples to your favor, because I'm not sure how that would affect capital formation broadly. And there could be obviously a typical sort of argument could be that there could be management issues in that regard, like, what's the accountability structure? But obviously I'm not going down that route. It seems like an ignorant sort of argument. But I guess my only view would be that I think that an economy, even if possible under that organization, I'm not sure we could consider it a socialist economy because of the predominance of private investment, 60% of the economy, and the only apparently small section of the economy that's actually worker run and owned.
So what definition of socialism do you think we should be using?
So again, to me, when I think of socialism, at least the way that I think of it in the debates that I've seen and the people I've heard talk about it, it typically is either one, like a Richard Wolff style definition, where the workers make the decisions on the micro level, or where the workers own the means of production. Those to me are those definitions of socialism that I would understand and operate under.
Sure. So, why is it that you go with these two as opposed to the historic ones or the more popular ones that the average person uses?
The more popular ones, I'm honestly not
sure.
Or the historic ones. Yeah, I'm not sure which definition is more popular. In terms of historic ones, I mean, where does the definition of workers owning the means of production come from? I mean, in my understanding, and to be fair, I could be ignorant in this regard. I'm not a historian, but I don't think that definition is a modern conception of socialism.
Workers owning the means of production wouldn't be modern. It would be it's a sort of like a misinterpretation of Marx's idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat. If we want to go back to the original definition of socialism, it would be a market socialist definition given by Robert Owen, who was a cooperativist.
Sure. So I understand.
Predating, just to be super clear, that's the first English one. The first definition of something that's like close enough to socialism would be socialisme, which I think was Henry de Saint-Simon, who was just using it to describe a predominantly socialized society. So the same way that I'm using it now, or very similar to the way that Robert Owen uses it.
I guess so. I mean, again, I'm not sure. Obviously, I've heard the idea of a collective ownership or a social ownership. There's obviously a lot of interpretation in regards to what that means. I tend to hear about the workers owning the means of production, and at least when hearing Richard Wolff talk about it, he seems to prefer the idea that the workers are making the decisions on the micro scale. And when you're talking about, a consumer cooperative or a producer cooperative, that's not the case, right? I mean, we're not empowering workers in that regard. It's the consumers and the producers that are making the decisions, right?
So in the case of Richard Wolff, I don't believe he actually gives a definition of socialism. He'll give you 3 different definitions that different people use. Then he'll tell you his preferred definition. Generally tends to be the one that's sort of just describes Marx's dictatorship of the proletariat. But he admits that there are more definitions even that use some form of like socialization over the means of production to actually describe what socialism is.
Well, this could be
even Wolff is
This could be a false memory, but I do remember him saying once that I think it was actually in his debate with Destiny, where he said that his socialism was a transformation of the microeconomic workplace, and that his socialism was when the workers made the decisions, right? And so it seems like, at least based on that quote, assuming that it's accurate, he would lean more towards my definition. But this to me is quite boring, really. I mean, that was my only point, was that a society where 60% of it is, privately operated and organized, and the other sort of, 2/3 or half of the other 40% that's left is, decided and run by the consumers or the producers. I guess I have a hard time calling that socialism. But
sure. So can I ask you a question about your definition?
Well, one more sentence. I was just going to say that this is the issue when talking about, I think, socialism, right? Is that it appears that you might call my capitalism socialism, and I might call your socialism capitalism. So I guess what's the difference?
Sure. So in the case of like Richard Wolff's position, I don't take it all too seriously. He's not a very serious individual. He doesn't seem to be backing his things up with like actual empirics. But to address your point, I want to ask you about the form of socialism that you've just described. What would qualify as socialism? Do you think that there is any society that has ever existed, or even ever hypothetically within the scope of reasonability could exist, not function properly, but just exist, could fit that definition?
Where the workers make the decision and or the workers own the means of production?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you could conceive of societies that would fit that definition, I think.
Societies where no black markets exist.
A society where no black markets exist? I mean... Yeah,
that would be a portion of the economy that couldn't be owned by the workers, right?
Sure. I guess it would depend on how we view the role of the state in this economy. But yeah, I mean, I would say generally that you could conceive of a society where there are no black markets. But of course, like let me use this.
You think it's possible?
Example, right? Well, let me use this as an example, right? So say we lived in a society where every business was a worker cooperative, and you had a social wealth fund and a state that sort of regulated whatever they needed to under a democratic framework. Let's say that I don't know. Let's say methamphetamine was illegal, right? as it is today. Naturally, any method that would exist is a black market, right? So, would that society, because they have an illegal trade of meth, not be considered socialist? To me, I guess I wouldn't say so. The black market seems like it wouldn't be reasonable to take away the socialism card from that economy.
Sure. So black markets can exist and a society can still be socialist. So a society doesn't have to be entirely socialist or entirely worker controlled by your definition to be socialist. It would just have to be predominantly worker controlled, right?
Well, no, I mean, I think when we're talking about, like, typically when we talk about capitalism or socialism, we're oftentimes not, we wouldn't typically include like a black market organization in that regard, right? I mean, we're talking about the upfront legal sort of, economy that people operate in the daytime, I suppose.
Okay, so what if there's one very, very, very small portion of the economy, like heroin dealers or something. They're not a black market. The government knows they exist. They just ignore them. This would make the economy no longer socialist by your definition.
Say that again. I'm confused by the example.
Sure. So in the example of the black market, the issue is the fact that it's a black market for you is why it doesn't get counted as like part of the economy in your socialism. If we were to grant the idea that this is no longer a black market, the government knows it exists, right? They just ignore it. Would you consider the society to no longer be socialist because the government knows and ignores the existence of this otherwise black market?
It's an interesting question. So if an illegal market existed, but the government just didn't give a shit about it, would it be considered socialist? It's a really interesting question. I'm not a socialist. I don't know how valuable my opinion is in this regard. I would say that society would... I mean, the market's illegal, I guess. So I'm not sure I think they would still be considered socialist by my mind. It's an illegal market. It's a black market still, even if the government ignores it.
Okay. What if the government makes it legal to sell heroin, but it's a very, very small, maybe a group of maybe it's they make it legal to sell heroin below a certain size, right? So as long as you're like only employing 1 or 2 people, it's fine for you to sell heroin. Would this still be socialism?
No, in my view, I don't think that would be considered socialism because you've got, private investment and employees that don't own the means of their production.
Okay. So, this definition of socialism seems so granular that I could not imagine it ever being possible in the real world. Which just sort of makes it like a useless definition because I'm trying to describe policy prescriptions, not, hypothetical utopian societies.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that your definition of socialism is so broad as to encompass what I would consider a lot of capitalist economies, right? I mean, for instance...
Can you name some?
Well, yeah, for instance, I mean, when we look at, say, Norway, for instance, I think a majority of the wealth of Norway is owned within the government apparatus, right? Now, is that a society that...
You might be mistaken on that one. I'm not entirely sure where you're getting that from, but I'd cede it to you if you could give me a source.
Yeah, sure. I can look it up. Wealth of Norway. But yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that we would consider this a socialist economy, right? In general, right? If we look at, say, the Australian economy, right? They've got the superannuation, like an incredibly large portion of the wealth of Australia is tied up in the pension system, right? It's a collectively sort of, you could say, collectively owned, government operated organization. And I think that under your definition, it's almost like there's just a spectrum of socialism, right? Where you're either not very socialist at all, or you're very, very, very socialist, right? And so, that's kind of, it seems like your definition is over-encompassing. You might say my definition is under-encompassing.
Well, you're saying mine might include countries like Norway. Does your definition of socialism include any countries?
No, I mean, I think, and to be fair, what I would say is that most socialists would probably agree with me that there's no socialist country that...
Real socialism has never been tried.
This is a common statement said by socialists, yes.
Yeah, in this case, it just seems like it just would... Your definition is so small, it ends up being... it encompasses no governments that have ever existed and no governments that could feasibly exist. So just for the purpose of like describing actual policies, I'd recommend we use the description, the definition I'm using, which we probably could say would point to real world governments, right? In the case of most socialists who I've talked to, social wealth funds are absolutely a form of market socialism. At least most market socialists I've talked to. I don't really know exactly why we would use this almost useless definition that can't really describe anything. It's a label without anything to label.
Maybe this super chat can help clear some of this up. What's the difference between distributism and distributionism?
Oh, distributism. You wrote distributionism. I hope that's not a different thing. Socialism it is very similar. Market socialism and distributism are similar systems. But I guess the difference might be that distributism seems to place a higher value on small businesses than a market socialist would by a notable margin.
I think, boy, you can keep going.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure. Again, it seems like there's not a lot of runway left in this conversation. I mean, we might just be repeating ourselves, but no, I mean, yeah, I don't think. I think most socialists typically would probably agree with me that there's never been a socialist sort of economy, or one that's been a sort of a true academic socialist economy, you might say. And it seems like your definition of socialism is one that is, in my view, over-encompassing. It seems like it would place both China and France on the spectrum of socialism, and at least, from looking at the Communist Party, not the Communist Party of China, they would consider themselves quite socialist. But if we look at the Communist Party of France or Greece or something like that, I'm not sure those parties would consider the governing structures of their economy as broadly socialist, even though they have quite a lot of public, a large public sector. They have sort of national industry, things like that. And again, the Norwegian economy, I'm not sure we would consider socialist either. But, at least to me, I feel like my definition is more, I suppose, agreeable to the average socialist, right? I think most socialists would agree with me that those countries are not socialist. They might engage in some socialist practice, similar to how the United States, by having a social security system or a Medicaid system, is engaging in that somewhat, but we wouldn't consider them broadly socialist economies.
Sure. So I would agree that a country which is not predominantly socialistic or socialized wouldn't be a socialist economy. It would be a mostly capitalist economy with some aspects of socialist policies. And I think if you ask the average American, they agree on this definition. If you ask the average person, even globally, they seem to agree that socialism is not some very specific misuse of Marx's idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat, but instead a more wide-ranging definition, which encompasses a lot more under the umbrella of socialism. But if your dispute is just a semantic one, and you agree with me on what seems to be most of the policy prescriptions, then it's just a matter of you would support the policy prescription of a worker co-op based economy.
No, not necessarily. You would just have to prove that it would make sense. So I guess if we're going to talk more about the policy side, which might be more equipped to talk about, the more sort of academic, what is socialism, what isn't, might not be as interesting. But in general, agree to disagree on that. I mean, I'd like you to answer the idea, though, that, and I'm not sure I got a great answer on it, was the idea that if we incentivize the organization of cooperatives, right, the cooperative organization, I should say, who is to say that they would actually become a 40% of the economy, right? I mean, what evidence can we point to that is the case?
Sure. So the evidence we could point to is we could make an abduction, given that we do see when certain things are incentivized through some kind of government loan structure or some kind of any other kind of subsidization, either direct or indirect, which indirect seems to be the one you're advocating for. We do actually see a very large scale growth in this industry. Oftentimes, the government can take up the majority of a certain industry, within a country at least, by doing these sort of public investments in it. I don't think that this wouldn't be the case for something like the worker cooperatives and industry overall. I don't think it would be unfeasible for us to get to 40%. If we see that non-worker cooperatives are, when subsidized by the government, can be a very large portion of the economy. Worker cooperatives specifically could also be a very large portion of the economy.
Right. I guess it would just depend on what portion of the economy. So, at what point is it just a majority? So, if the economy is a majority owned by a social wealth fund and a cooperatively organized, is that the point that it becomes a more socialist economy?
It would become a mostly socialist economy. Yeah.
If its majority sort of wealth of the nation is controlled either by cooperatives or by cooperatives, you mean consumer and worker cooperatives or a social wealth fund?
So this would be a mostly socialist economy. It seems like around the 50% mark is probably still like a mixed economy. I have no problem with calling this mixed economy and calling a predominantly socialist something upwards of 80% and a mostly socialist anything over 50%.
I got you. Okay, so you don't really take any strong views on the sort of coercive nature of capitalism or the exploitation of the worker, I suppose. It sounds like you're more just whatever makes people happier and more rich.
The coercive nature of capitalism. I think this is something you wouldn't reject either. You would just agree with this. But I don't believe in Marx's idea of the theory of exploitation. I do agree that capitalism is exploitative, and I think you do too.
I think capitalism can be exploitative, right? I guess, if you leave 49% of the economy to be privately run and organized, we've now got 49% of the economy that is like being exploited, I guess, right? So what's the justification for? Oh, I see got another super chat, Pedro.
No, that was an accident. Right now, I'm writing down questions. You're good. Keep going.
You're good. So I guess. Even though we might say that capitalism is exploitative, leaving 49% of the economy to be under that sort of exploitative system, under your view, might be okay because the outcomes are better than they are bad.
Yeah, and I think you'd agree with that. Might be okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess so. That's kind of what the question was for. Was that you don't seem to be taking a very I guess academic the exploitation, labor theory of value. You're not that kind of socialist. It sounds like.
Well, Marx's theory of exploitation was not like a normative moral claim about exploitation always being wrong.
No, I understand that, right? But you don't seem to be using that as your frame of analysis.
I'm not a Marxist. I've said this a couple times.
Right, that's what I'm saying. You're not a socialist because you feel like the worker is being exploited by the capitalist elite. You're more just focused on sort of economic outcome and environmental outcome.
Not just environmental outcome. I'm invested in who has control over society. I think that democracies have good arguments in favor of them. I think a lot of these good arguments in favor of democracies in terms of government overall could also exist in the sort of smaller government-esque structure of corporations. I think democracy is a good thing generally.
Do you think unions are socialists?
I wouldn't consider unions socialist, no. But I think that they are. A lot of socialists do consider them to be socialistic. The syndicalists and such, I think, would consider unions to be a pathway to socialism.
Okay. So you wouldn't consider like an economy that has 80 or 90% union membership. This is not a socialist economy.
No.
Okay.
It doesn't have collectively owned factors of production. The unions don't own the factors of production.
Sure. Yeah. It's obviously a give and take between the capital owners and the workers. Right. That's an interesting thought. I don't know. I don't have any more questions. I mean, really, I'm not sure where we can go from here. It seems like we actually seem to mostly agree on the policy prescriptions. We disagree on the scale at which they'll be effective. We disagree on what socialism is and what it means. And that's pretty much it. I mean, I don't have any more questions. If you have any questions for me, you can ask them. Other than that, I'm down to do whatever Pedro wants.
Awesome. Okay, we can stop the clock here. Or did you want to run an interrogation on from your end, Synth, on Econoboi?
I mean, if Econoboi is sure, we could probably fill out a little bit more. So I think that when it comes to the last 20 minutes here, it just makes sense that it would be the case that if you actually have like reasons to dispute the positions I hold, we may as well like hash them out. Like what is your reason for disagreeing? As long as it's not a reason I've already addressed, hopefully.
Disagreeing with what? Like specifically?
The aspects of my position you just said you disagree with.
Yeah, I mean, I don't. So my thought process is that I'm not sure that there's good evidence that if we care about the environment, I'm not sure that there's great evidence that a sort of socialist mode of production, right, like a cooperatively owned economy, I suppose, would be more effective at transitioning the environment to be green and sustainable. And in regard to the ability to get cooperatives to be a predominance of the economy, I don't think these sort of soft sort of loan incentives or capital gains tax incentives generally, I guess, I don't know that those would necessarily lead to a predominance of consumer and worker cooperatives. I guess you've said during this debate that producer cooperatives wouldn't be considered, I guess socialist. Like it seems like you'd prefer consumer and worker cooperatives. So it doesn't seem like that would really lead to 40% of the economy being consumer and worker cooperatives, I guess. You might be muted, Synth. I'm not sure.
Yeah, he's muted.
There we go.
All right, there we go. All right. So you said, starting with the first one, you said there's no good evidence. I believe you said social wealth funds would transition economy to be more green.
No. I said cooperative organization. I think social wealth funds, we can make a decent argument that those could... Oh, man, someone is typing loud as fuck. But no, I think with social wealth funds, there's a decent argument that these could help the economy become more green. But I don't think an economy that I don't think an economy that has some portion of it tied to a social wealth fund is necessarily socialist. I mean, that's where we disagree. Like, I don't think Norway is socialist because they have a social wealth fund.
What if 100% of the economy was a social wealth fund?
So under my definition, where the workers would need to have the control and decision-making capacity, I would not call that a socialist economy, like, because the government's basically just making all of the oversight and decisions, right? By that logic,
so what if it's a social wealth fund in which you have what if it's a social wealth fund in a democratic society?
Well, again, like, say that the Norwegian social wealth fund owned every company in Norway, right?
Mm-hmm.
To me, and I really have to stress this, to me, this would not be a socialist economy. It wouldn't really necessarily be capitalist. It would be some sort of weird third category.
Like socialism, but with a market.
No, I mean, again, by that definition, China is a market socialist economy, right? That would be accomplishing the goals that you see happening currently, right? But again,
no, China doesn't have a democratic society, right?
Well, okay, you're saying democracy is a necessary component of socialism. Yeah, I mean, well, under that definition, Norway. I don't think Norway would be considered a socialist economy. Now, if we would say that the whole entire sort of country's businesses are owned under a social wealth fund, but none of the workers actually have an ability to make decisions on their workplace, it's still sort of a hierarchy. Capital owners and whatnot are still making decisions. It's just that capital owners are the governments. I mean, still, I think under a lot of definitions, this wouldn't be a socialist economy. There's no micro transformation of the workplace in that regard. So
in the case of the case of these worker cooperatives, they still have hierarchies there as well. They elect some kind of representative. It's effectively representative democracy in most worker cooperatives. So if the entire economy was worker co-ops, your definition of socialism should exclude them as well?
No. When I say hierarchy, I mean, I'm talking about the relationship between capital and labor, right? Of course, a cooperative has a hierarchy. They still have managers and differentiations in pay and responsibility. But I would say that an economy that's entirely owned and operated by cooperatives would be a socialist economy, would be a market socialist economy, I guess, to be specific.
But you don't think an economy that's entirely social wealth fund would be considered, you said, workers controlling the means of production?
I think you would, obviously. To me, I think that you need some necessary micro transformation where the workers own the actual place that they work, the means of their individual production.
So in the case of a social wealth fund, you think there's workers don't control the means of production. I'm curious why you think if you elect a representative who then appoints the board of directors, who then appoints a CEO, why is this not worker control, but you elect a representative who then appoints your manager would be worker control?
I guess I have to see the kinds of structures you're talking about in terms of cooperatives. Most cooperatives are relatively small, so I'm not sure they use this sort of representative system you're describing. I know that Mondragon has a council and stuff like that, but there's a lot of, people have a lot of problems with Mondragon in general. But yeah, to me, generally, yeah, I would say that, a cooperative to me is more under the veil of socialism, workers owning the means of their production, than a social wealth fund.
Yeah, but you said even in the case of cooperatives, the fact that they even if they are representative, even if these representative cooperatives are the entirety of the economy, you would consider that socialism, but social wealth funds wouldn't be. I'm asking you, what's the symmetry breaker there? Why is this one representative democracy not workers controlling the means of production, but the other one is workers controlling the means of production?
Because the workers who work at the individual firms don't have a decision-making capacity for their individual firm. They might be able to vote on a representative that might appoint members of boards of directors for certain companies, maybe all companies. This seems like it would get quite inefficient at 100% ownership, but let's just say that they could do it. But that's not a direct, say or vote in that company, right? And if we wanted to quibble over, does a cooperative that has a representative system, like a big, sort of governing structure, is that considered socialism? I mean, they still have the ownership tied in with the decision-making capacity. So, I mean, to me, I would say so.
So with the social wealth fund, the ownership would be the entirety of the society overall. In the case of a social wealth fund, if society was one big worker cooperative, you would still consider this socialism, but for some reason with the social wealth fund you don't. It almost just seems like the issue is that it's a social wealth fund, not that it's like anything to do with democratic control of the means of production.
Well, under a social wealth fund, workers do not directly own the social wealth fund. The government owns and operates it, right? Now, workers might have some benefits, like maybe that's how they fund the pension. They might control sort of an environmental policy in that regard. But no, I mean, when the government is owned, or when the government owns the social wealth fund, to me, this would be an odd. I'm not sure we've achieved socialism in this regard, right? It seems different, and obviously, I think generally there'd be a lot of problems in a society that's 100% owned by a social wealth fund, but that's kind of a different point.
Okay, so yeah, that would be a different point. In the case of your distinction between why you think the worker cooperative model is socialism and the social wealth fund isn't, you said in one case the government controls it. So I can make the same argument, like in one case the person who you elect to run the one big worker cooperative would be the person who actually controls it. But then you'd make the argument, right? Well, that person is elected by the workers, and thus the workers are actually the ones controlling it. In the case of a democratically controlled social wealth fund, the people democratically elect the president or something like this. Or in the case of Norway, they elect their prime minister, right? And then this person then has the ability to appoint people to the effectively the controlling board of the social wealth fund. Both cases should be equally democratic or worker control over the means of production. Well, I don't know where your distinction lies.
Well, because the worker doesn't directly own their individual business when it's just owned by a social wealth fund, right? Typically, at least the way that I've seen some socialists describe their position is ownership tied in with decision-making capacity, right? So when you own your individual business, I think that's a lot different in terms of management structure, how you might organize yourselves, the actual benefits that it confers, right? Than when a social wealth fund owns your business. You're separated by quite a larger extent from the ownership and the means of your production when there's a social wealth fund versus actual ownership of your individual company.
Okay, so it's ownership plus decision-making capacity, you're saying. So in the case of a social wealth fund, despite the fact that it's owned socially by society overall, thus it would be worker ownership, it doesn't have the decision-making capacity aspect of it. If this is your argument, I'm curious, who do you think in a private business has decision-making capacity?
In a private business, like just a traditionally owned company?
Sure.
Yeah, in a traditionally owned company, the decisions that are being made is by the management, who are, sort of appointed by the board, who are appointed by the shareholders.
Sure, and so the ultimate decision-making capacity is of the shareholders, right?
No, I mean, shareholders don't make management decisions. They pretty much just appoint the board, right?
Okay, so the shareholders don't have decision-making capacity, you're saying?
They have decision-making capacity over the broad direction of the business, but not over, individual management decisions.
Okay. So in this case, the worker cooperative model would be the exact same, right? The workers could then appoint some kind of head president of the worker cooperative. You think this is still decision-making capacity on the part of the workers?
Well, I mean, it depends on the structure, right? So say that we had a society that was organized entirely like Mondragon, where you've just got these big conglomerate cooperatives that compete with each other, and they might have superstructures like the sort of council of cooperatives or whatever. If the employees still have ownership of their individual cooperatives and they can still determine whether they want to participate in something like that, to me, I mean, that would
Yes.
be they're making the decision to participate in such a superstructure.
Sure, and if it's one big worker cooperative where you appoint one person to the head, and then that person employs the management of these different subsections of the worker cooperative, that would still be socialism for you, but a social wealth fund wouldn't.
So if the economy was just one giant worker cooperative, you're saying?
If it was one big worker co-op, one huge worker co-op, yeah.
That's an interesting question. So basically, if we had a business that monopolized the entire economy and it was just one huge, gigantic fucking co-op, we wouldn't even have a state at that point, just one sort of corporate government, would that be a cooperative? Would that be socialism if the workers had equal decision-making capacity and equal ownership of that business? Yeah, to me, the answer would probably be yes.
Okay, so in this society, everyone has one vote, and they can appoint the big president of the big cooperative, and then this president could each of the little tiny sub-cooperatives that the big cooperative has the actual control over. They can appoint little managers to it. I don't see how this is structurally not just a social wealth fund. That's the social wealth fund.
Because in a society with a social wealth fund, again, the ownership is really the state, and the individual businesses are not owned. I mean, we're going in circles. I think you understand what I'm saying. You just disagree with the distinction.
What is the true ownership? I don't understand what you're saying. It seems like you have a more amorphous definition of socialism than you were accusing me of.
Not at all. I mean, you seem to define, to a certain extent, both Norway and France as some form of socialism, at least on the spectrum of socialism, whereas
maybe a mixed economy.
I understand, but you seem to view socialism as a spectrum where Norway and France might be further to like the socialism spectrum compared to like maybe China or the US. Just depends on the structure, right? And so what I'm saying is, I think, relatively consistent, which is that socialism is when the workers own the means of production and the workers make the decisions, right? In a society with a social wealth fund, the workers do not own the direct means of their production. It is a nebulous conglomerate sort of social wealth fund where every worker owns a little bit of every other person's workplace through the government, right? This isn't like directly you own the production that you're working on, right? I mean, I'm sure you can understand the difference and what I'm trying to get at in that regard.
I'm gonna be real with you. I have no idea how you're trying to even like draw this distinction here. In the case of a social wealth fund, you're saying like they're all splitting up the ownership. Like, yeah, that's true for one big worker co-op too. They all split up the ownership. That's just how a cooperative works.
Okay. Is a social wealth fund owned and operated by the government or the people?
It's owned by the people and operated by the government on their behalf.
Okay, so if I was a person in a society, like say I lived in Norway, could I sell my share of the social wealth fund?
You can't sell your share in a cooperative either.
You can sell your share of a cooperative. You can leave the cooperative and exit your investment of the cooperative.
You can exit your investment of the cooperative and like let somebody else buy in, you're saying?
Well, if you work for a cooperative, you're not like forced to work there, right? I mean, you can sell your share and leave. Ultimately it's just
you might be thinking of an ESOP. If you're not a worker at a worker cooperative, you're not allowed to own the share.
No, that's what I'm saying, right? If I was a worker at a worker cooperative and there's 10 employees and I own a tenth of the worker cooperative, right? Say that I left that job, right? I'm selling my share of the cooperative and getting another job, right? I'm exiting my relationship of the cooperative. If I live in a society where 100% of the economy is controlled by a social wealth fund that's run by the government, I cannot sell my social wealth fund share, right? It's a government apparatus that I'm living under. To me, this isn't socialism.
You can become like an expat or something, right? You could like leave the country in the same way you would like leave the country if it was one big worker co-op.
Well, in a situation where a country is one big worker co-op, you could still, I think, sell your share of the worker co-op. Now, you'd probably have a hard time getting a job, it sounds like, if there's only one cooperative in the entire economy. But to me, that's kind of a big difference, is your ability to leave and sell your shares, make decisions on the business, the direct
You could leave Norway if you were in Norway.
I understand that, but you really have to understand what I'm saying, right? You understand that what I'm saying is that the social wealth fund is owned fundamentally and operated.
I understand what you're trying to say.
Government.
The distinction is just it doesn't actually exist, right? So I understand what you're.
Actually exist.
Yeah. So the distinction you're drawing between like true ownership here is completely arbitrary, and that's why you're only able to say like you get what I'm saying as opposed to like putting it into words.
Well, I put it into words several times. I'll do it one more time and see if I can make you understand. So, again, when everything in society is owned by a social wealth fund, 100% of society is owned under the social wealth fund, all the businesses, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, we're not including public employees, right? All the private employees work for businesses that are owned by a social wealth fund. Those employees do not have a say directly in the operations of that business. You might be able to say, hey, they vote for representatives that vote for the sort of executive that end up appointing people to boards that end up eventually trickling down into their company. But these are broad decisions on a macro scale. And on a micro scale, workers don't have any control over their business. There's no sort of individual interest at play. It's completely
Can I give you why I'm having trouble understanding it?
Okay, go
in the case of Yeah. So you said the worker co-op that owns all of society that you appoint a president to would be. So in this case, the argument you just made for why a social wealth fund isn't socialism would also apply to that thing you say is socialism. They don't have a say in it directly. They vote for representatives. These are broad decisions on a macro scale. All of these are true of that hypothetical worker co-op, correct?
No, because you can sell your share of the cooperative and you own the actual business you work in. Now, just because your business is a superstructure doesn't mean you don't have an ownership stake in the company. I mean, for instance, when we're talking about Mondragon as an example of a cooperative federation, right? You don't own the broad cooperative federation. You own your individual company that is part of this broad federation, right? And your company has decided to join this federation and elect representatives. You still have decision-making capacity for your individual 10 or 20 person cooperative, right? This is a far cry from a society that's 100% owned by a social wealth fund and going from there, right? I mean,
all right, so we got about three minutes left. I want to see if we can track this really fast. Okay, so if a reason why that social wealth fund is because they don't have the say directly and they vote for representatives, is this the reason why you're saying the social wealth fund isn't socialist? Because it's the one you gave earlier.
No, they don't have ownership directly. When you're talking about cooperative federations, they still own the individual cooperative they work in. Sure.
All right, so this might be why I'm having trouble understanding you, because I'm about 100% sure. I wrote it down as you were saying it, that you said they don't have a say directly, they vote for representatives. Is this what you said earlier, or are we like?
No, I said they don't have ownership, right? The government is ultimately the one.
You said they don't have say directly, they vote for representatives.
Good God. I mean, maybe
you said these are broad decisions on a macro scale. So it wasn't like a misspeak there. It was just that was the point you were trying to make. Well, this is why I'm having trouble understanding you.
No, I'll repeat for like the 100th time. When you work.
Okay, what is the? Can I ask you just to make it really clear? Can you make give me the one trait you think that actually distinguishes this, or the list of traits even?
Direct ownership. For the 100 millionth time, direct ownership. When you work for a business owned by a social wealth fund, you do not have direct ownership in the means of your production, nor do you have direct decision-making capacity for your business. The decisions you might
direct ownership and decision-making capacity.
My last sentence. The decision-making capacity for a broad macro scale, voting for broad macro policy, is probably a lot different than for your individual business that you would make if you had direct control over that business.
Okay, this is the issue. Once again, you are including the decision-making capacity part. If it's just the direct ownership, we can talk about that. But if it's the decision-making capacity part, that would be just as true for the one big worker co-op that owns all of the government and has one person who leads it, as it is for the social wealth fund. It's equally true for both of those things. In the case of the direct ownership aspect of it, the direct ownership is just, I'm just kind of curious what you mean by direct ownership, because in the case of a social wealth fund, it is the citizenry who owns it. You could have a condition of ownership in a worker cooperative in which you are not allowed to sell your shares. This is very common in worker cooperatives. Most cooperatives do not function like credit unions do.
Right, and so I guess the distinction that I would draw is that in a society say for instance I worked at trying to think of a good example. Say that I worked for a shoe manufacturing company, and let's say that the broad society voted to do something with regard to the board of directors that negatively affected my business. Wasn't bad for the environment, it's just not the right direction for my business. I, as a worker in that company, have no say in that decision. I might disagree with the majority rule of my business, right? But I have no say. However, if I, as an individual person who owns a portion of that shoemaking company in a cooperatively owned economy, to me, that is socialism, because you can make the decisions that collectively within the business you think are best for your business. You're not at the will of a broad sort of collective of companies.
In many worker cooperatives, a tremendous amount of worker cooperatives, you do have an elected representative. You think this is socialism too, so that was like a non-point.
No. Again,
all right, guys, the timer is up, unfortunately, so I gotta stop it here. I'll move in the closing statements. EB or Econoboi, sorry, I was looking at your avatar. Since you were just about to go, I'll let you make your closing statement right now.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, I'm not sure how material it is. Again, Mondragon is so when you work at Mondragon. But by the way, how long is our closing statement? I guess I should ask that before I don't know.
7 minutes.
Oh, that's a heck of a closing statement. Okay, well, I guess I've got enough time then. It's just to say that when you work at Mondragon, as an example, Synth is talking about electing representatives, right? In Mondragon, when you elect representatives, you do, right? But Mondragon is a federation of cooperatives, right? When you work at Mondragon, you only own your individual cooperative that you work within, right? You don't own like cooperative A, B, C, D, E, F, G, right? You only own cooperative A, the one that you actually work in. Cooperatives voluntarily become a part of this federation, and then elect representatives to be, I suppose they're representatives for the cooperative federation, right? To me, this is different when you can decide to leave the federation, you can sell your individual ownership in your actual company, your cooperative, and at the end of the day, the decisions that your individual cooperative makes, not with regard to other cooperatives in the sort of industry or in the economy, only with regard to your individual cooperative's decisions. To me, this is a lot different than when a society is sort of wholly owned by a social wealth fund, and potentially, despite the will of the actual workers at your individual business, you are now at the will of a sort of collective, decision, indirect democracy of a social wealth fund. To me, this is different. Honestly, it doesn't really matter, I guess. Ultimately, clearly, my definition of socialism works under my view of socialism. Obviously, Synth's definition works under his view of socialism. I'm not really sure how much it matters. Ultimately, this debate was kind of interesting. It definitely gave me a lot to think about with regard to how I view socialism. Synth, obviously, I'd love it if you could link me the historical definition of socialism and how it, how I suppose how the term of socialism and how it's evolved over time. To me, I've always heard it viewed as the collective ownership by the workers, not necessarily collective ownership generally. So that's how I've always framed my analysis of socialism, and it seems like that's how a lot of socialists today frame their analysis of socialism as well. But I'd be interested to read in that regard. I think that under a definition where most of society is under the definition where if most of society is collectively owned, whether that be through state apparatus or through cooperative organization, whether it's consumer, maybe producer, and then worker cooperatives or a social wealth fund, if under that apparatus a society is socialist, then an economy like Norway's would be considered socialist because, at least from my understanding, a majority of the wealth of Norway is actually, if you look at the total wealth of Norway, a majority of it is sort of accounted for by the social wealth fund. And so under Synth's definition, that would be a society that I'm not sure he would say is socialist, but is a mostly socialist economy. And to me, that seems a bit odd, but it appears to just be an honest disagreement of how we view and frame socialism in general. I guess overall, my sort of closing statement with regard to the issue, cooperatives, that was what the original debate was about. I think cooperatives are great. There's nothing wrong with cooperatives intrinsically or in general. I think that anything that society can do to implement democratic structures within the workplace or democratic apparatuses within the workplace are fine. It's just important that they're organic and that they're oriented around the workers' decisions. I don't think it would be, and this isn't what Synth advocates for, right? So don't get me wrong here. It's just that the idea of a cooperative mandate or the idea of even mandating like a worker board membership, I think could have its problems. But if you implement structures where workers can decide to be in unions, workers can decide to have worker board membership, and workers have advantageous sort of government regulated or funded structures wherein they can form cooperatives of their own within the industries that they feel that they know the best about, that they're the best in. I feel like in that regard, we've accomplished a social democratic society that I would consider capitalist, that depending on the structure, Synth might consider mostly socialist. But ultimately, what we've accomplished is a better society. And that's sort of my point here. It appears that we spent most of the time quibbling over definitions of socialism, but that's kind of immaterial. It appears that we actually seem to agree on the prescriptions, almost like prescription for prescription, that we agree with. And I'm sure Synth wouldn't say that anything's wrong with my prescriptions. And it seems like we wouldn't even necessarily disagree with I wouldn't even necessarily disagree with some of Synth's prescriptions. I think social wealth funds, to talk about those a little bit, social wealth funds appear to be fine. I have to look more into the Norwegian social wealth fund system. I did read a stat somewhere that a third of stock equity in Norway is owned by the social wealth funds. I guess I have to fact check myself in that regard. I may have been misreading something, or I may just not be able to find it. But that was my understanding. But apparently Synth says, no, in fact, there's a regulation that you cannot own Norwegian companies under the social wealth fund. I know they have two social wealth funds. Maybe there's a difference there. But in general, no, social wealth funds appear to be fine. My understanding is that there's around 80 social wealth funds in the world, and they all tend to be just fine. I think that in America, something that would be interesting would be that if we structured our social security system to be a social wealth fund where you could invest in sort of a broad market index of equities. This would be a way to extend the life of Social Security without raising taxes on anyone. Nobody likes getting taxes raised on themselves. Australia has a system of mandatory retirement accounts that are actually market sort of equity and bond based, not necessarily just government treasury and tax based. So I think stuff like that we can actually agree on the prescriptions of. But unfortunately, I think in terms of a debate, that wouldn't be very interesting to just have me and Synth agreeing on policy prescriptions over and over again. Rather, we disagree on the effectiveness of those policy prescriptions in regard to accomplishing socialism. And it appears we disagree with definitions of socialism. And it appears we disagree with regard to can I suppose a socialist mode of production necessarily accomplish things like environmental sustainability, inequality, shrinkage, and stuff like that. But overall, it was probably not the most entertaining debate, but it definitely gave me a lot to think about. And I hope that from the audience's perspective, it gave them a lot to think about as well. It was really fun having this conversation, Synth.
Awesome, Synth. You can take over whenever you're ready. Oh, we can't hear you, brother.
There we go. Okay. I completely agree here, Econoboi. Don't expect me to fill out the full 7 minutes. I don't really have that much to say, but it didn't seem like Econoboi disputed any of the policy prescriptions that market socialists make. Just predicted different outcomes to them, and didn't really seem to have a means of abducting to what those expectations were, outside of the ones that we just we already went over. It seems to be the case that these policy prescriptions could actually reasonably be used to increase the amount of cooperatives in society to a relatively large amount. But if you agree with the policy prescriptions, then from there we can operate on that, as long as we agree with that, on what we should do, I should say. With like many SOCDEMs, I think it just seems to be the case that Econoboi just is kind of a market socialist. He agrees with market socialists on every single policy prescription and makes differences only in like the potential outcomes of those. When it comes to the idea of like an amorphous definition of socialism, it seemed like Econoboi hadn't really thought much about the definition beforehand, and I understand this. You don't claim yourself to be a socialist, so it's not one you really delved into. But it did seem like you had to pretty frequently change your qualifications for what is socialism to make sure the social wealth fund for the entirety of society isn't, despite the fact that this would pretty reasonably even be worker ownership over the means of production, while a worker cooperative that existed for the entirety of society would be socialism for you. The history of the definition of socialism is pretty interesting as well. The term comes from Henry de Saint-Simon's Socialisme, and then in English it comes from Robert Owen's socialism, both of which are based around socialization, not the Marxist idea of the Marxist idea of a dictatorship of the proletariat. Even Marx believed that socialism was not just the dictatorship of the proletariat. He believed it was like interchangeable with the term communism, which is why I think it's probably useless to use his definition. An economy like Norway's, I wouldn't say a socialist. They seem to be primarily capitalistic. If you gave me information that shows that they are actually a mostly socialist economy, for the sake of actually communicating, it seems more reasonable that either way we'd continue to call them a mixed economy and not a purely capitalist or a purely socialist one. In the case of Norway's GDP, I'm not actually sure why you would believe that GDP is mostly social wealth fund. It doesn't actually seem to be that. I think you said wealth or something actually, so I could just be like misremembering. I'd consider it mostly capitalistic, but a highly socialized economy in the case of Norway, and they do have two social wealth funds. One is they're both part of the larger pension fund, but their two social wealth funds are the larger scale one, the very, very large one that only invests in outside companies, and they have a much smaller one which invests internally within Norway. I could imagine the one which invests internally within Norway is entirely, obviously, Norwegian companies. That would be reasonable to me. It's just that's very, very, very small in terms of the overall size of their pension fund. Most of it is their social wealth fund where they invest in other countries. But I'm not going to fill out the whole 4 minutes.
Awesome. No worries. You don't have to. So now, like we do usually on the show, I have some questions that I've been taking down, some notes. And really, honestly, I think in that last 20 minutes, you guys knocked down a lot of stuff that I wanted to ask about. I think the only thing I want to get to is the hour and 2 mark. You guys mentioned Richard Wolff. Do either of you even like Richard Wolff? Like, would you say, in respect, that we advocate their ideas, or have you both just thrown him over the rail after the whole Destiny debate?
I guess to go first, I would say I'm I don't like Richard Wolff because he has honestly buffoonish views of economics, depending on the subject he's talking about. He's really just a big co-op guy. I think fundamentally it is a fair way to describe Richard Wolff. And his recent stuff really put the nail in the coffin in terms of his credibility in my regard when he was saying that the anti-vax movement is but a sign of the capitalist issues in the economy, and that socialists should ally themselves with the anti-vax workers to try and co-opt the movements. And it's like, my God. So that's my opinion on Richard Wolff. But of course, as someone who calls themselves a capitalist, I guess I wouldn't necessarily agree with most of what Richard Wolff has to say.
Sure. So my answer would be I'm not a Marxist. So that alone puts me at odds with most of what Richard Wolff believes. Also, even if he was just a Marxist alone and he stopped there and didn't like have all of these other like insane, stupid beliefs, like the idea that we should ally with the anti-vax movement, as Econoboi recently mentioned, which I think he said on Jimmy Dore's show. Allying with Jimmy Dore is bad enough. Not a tremendous fan of Dore here as well.
Awesome. Okay, so we can move into some of the audience questions that I had written down. Honestly, if I have to make any kind of quote on Richard Wolff, if you're a professor in that many years for that field, and then out of nowhere you take a debate online with the guy who's been playing video games for his entire life, and he throws you over the rail that bad, I think anybody who you've taken money from to educate them on that subject, you owe them a serious refund. But here we go. From Louis Joyston, is socialism just state capitalism?
Obviously I would say no. And to be fair, Synth would probably say no as well. I would just say that state capitalism to me wouldn't necessarily be socialism, because to me, the sticking point of socialism that I tried to be consistent with throughout, I thought I was just the idea that workers owning the means of production. Workers don't own the means of their production under a state capitalist system, right? They don't make the decisions of their workplace. So that's, to me, what would make those not socialism.
Yeah, my answer would also be no, for different reasons. I think in the case of state capitalism, definitionally, if it's capitalism, it has to be non-collective control. So this would mean it's not socialist. It's that simple for me.
All right, and then from BioValve to Econoboi, why is your avatar an E to the power of B?
Well, so it's a short story that has a sad explanation. So I'm not a music guy. It's not an E flat. Unfortunately, I thought it was great branding, but a lot of people might be coming to my channel thinking it's a music channel. No, so I liked a creator called Moon, who was an Overwatch streamer for the time that I became a fan of him. And his logo, at least for a long time, it might still be, was a moon squared. So moon, right? Moon, power of the two. And I liked that because it was very simple and it was very sleek and it was easy to brand. And so when I was thinking about my channel and starting it, I went with an E raised to the B, little mathy economics, E to the power of B, Econoboi. But what I didn't know, because I'm not very much not a music person, that this also looks like an E flat. So that's the explanation of how I ended up looking like a music creator instead of an economics one. But hey, I mean, to me, the logo looks pretty good. It was also another reason I did it was because I'm a terrible graphic designer, and an E raised to the B was about the simplest thing I could think of that would look sleek enough.
All right, and that brings us to our next question from Andrew Slatt. He actually had a lot of questions that kind of got answered. That's why I'm not reading off all of them, Andrew. But let me just throw this one out. When Synth says that the government can recall them, does that then mean there are government departments whose function is to appoint members of boards of all companies in the economy?
What? Recall what?
Oh, that's probably my bad. I should have actually wrote down the context of it. I'm probably thinking of when, say, something weird happened. Ah, man, I can't remember specifically.
Sorry, Andrew. Better luck next time.
Yeah, sorry about that, Andrew. I'll go to his next one. In worker co-ops, do workers' stock/equity ever get transferred unwillingly?
If a worker leaves the company, oftentimes, yeah, it'll be transferred unwillingly, I guess. Depends on what you mean by unwillingly.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I mean, if I think one example might be if like you're fired, right? So if you're if you're voted out of the cooperative, right, that would be probably the best example of something like that happening.
Mm-hmm.
And when they leave, who gets to make the decisions on where their equity goes?
Goes to the worker cooperative as a whole. It just gets redistributed out, where you can have it like up in just like sitting around. I guess this effectively just means this like ends up being a semantic distinction. You could also say like you have it there and then somebody else buys in or something. But either way, like practically for practical purposes, it's the same effect.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think to add a bit onto that, I think I'm pretty sure that when you leave a cooperative, you are paid out of your ownership. I think that like if you own 1/10 of a cooperative and you get voted out, you get fired from the cooperative. It's similar to owning a corporation and being sort of thrown out of the ownership of a corporation, right? You have to be compensated for your ownership in that cooperative. I could be wrong on that. I just can't imagine a system that doesn't do that.
It depends on the cooperative. If you buy into the cooperative, more than likely it will. If you don't buy into the cooperative, more than likely it won't. Some cooperatives have buy-ins and some don't.
Of course, yeah. Okay, that's fair enough. Yeah.
Awesome. And then next question: how does the hiring process for a co-op / social wealth fund work? When is hiring someone not a good idea?
It depends on the co-op. In the case of a lot of cooperatives, you'll have somebody who's effectively doing the same thing as a hiring manager normally would in a private business. It's no different. It's just that instead of the hiring manager being decided by undemocratic means, it's decided by a democratic mean.
Yeah, it's a bad idea when the value of their labor doesn't it's a bad idea when the value of their labor based on the understanding of the cooperative doesn't exceed the distribution to them based on owning the cooperative, right? So if the value of your labor is like $5,000 a year, but it costs the cooperative, $5,500 a year in terms of, a dilution of ownership, then you wouldn't get hired. So that would be an example where it would be a bad idea.
Gotcha. And when Andrew Slatt was diligent, he was taking better notes than me and was able to come in with the context. When Sin says that the government can recall board members, does that mean that there are government departments who are dedicated to appoint members for all boards of all companies in the economy?
Not for all boards of all companies, but it would be if the social wealth fund owned all companies, then the case would be yes.
Yeah. To be fair, like if we look at Norway, for instance, right, they would be called like an institutional investor, right, similar to maybe an endowment or something like that, and they typically probably wouldn't take like majority stakes in publicly traded companies. So the ability for them to influence board decisions would really just be the proportion of the shares that they actually own, right? So they might only own a quarter of a company, so they have sort of that quarter of the votes in terms of who becomes a board member.
So this is the case for all ownership of shares. I'm not sure what the distinction there is.
Well, he was asking about recalling board members. Now, if we're talking practically, right? Typically, if you only own 25% of a company, you're not going to be able to just be like, I hate this board member, get him out of the company, right? Because you don't own a majority of the company's stock, right? That's where the difference would come in. Like, I'm not sure Norway would act in that way with regard to board membership.
All right, gentlemen. And with that, I am out of questions, and we perfectly hit our 2-hour mark. Let's give our close or shamelessly plug yourselves. Since you want to go first and send yourself off.
Sure. I'm on youtube.com/SINTHE. That's just the name, the way it's spelled on screen. And that's where I do most of my stuff. You can go ahead and subscribe there if you want to find more of me.
Awesome. Thanks, Sense. Econoboi, you want to tell them one more time where they can find you?
Yeah, sure. Hey, everyone. So I'm Econoboi. The last debate I did on here was against Andrew about immigration, which was pretty fun. And if you didn't subscribe to me then, the YouTube is Econoboi. I do a lot of debates about economic issues, social issues broadly as well. And I also do scripted videos. I think the last scripted video I released was, actually about cooperatives. Unlearning Economics and I both released videos about sort of cooperatives and workplace democracy, we seem to come to very similar conclusions, which was pretty fun to see, as he's a more socialist person, I'm a more capitalist person in terms of how we view the world. And yeah, so I do all that kind of stuff. So if you're interested in economics, subscribe to my channel, Econoboi on YouTube. Oh, and last thing, I'm doing a policy tournament on Twitter where you get to vote on policies you might prioritize. So if you're interested in that, go to my Twitter and vote. Voting opens in the next round tomorrow, actually. So.
Gotcha. Hey, gentlemen, I want to thank you both for a spirited debate. That was very high IQ of both of you. Yeah, Sin, I know you're supposed to be coming back on the 14th for a Synth versus the World session, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. That should be really fun.
So far, to me, I think you're going to do just fine. You've proven yourself in this arena very well, so you're going to do just fine. So I'm going to send you guys both off. Have a great night. Thank you for coming on, guys.
All right. See ya.
Bye, guys.
And ladies and gentlemen, in closing, that's not Synth versus the World on the 14th is not all what we got for you. We have Monday, that's the 13th, James Coombs from Modern Day Debate coming on for an interview. That's going to be with Andrew. I will not be there, but that man is probably another supporter of the channel who, you know, has given us a chance to build something like this by letting us on his platform. We also have Polly People versus Rob Knorr coming up. For some strange reason, you guys wanted that on the 15th, but it is happening. And then finally, we have pretty much what is going to be a battle royale on the 18th between Night Nation Radio, the Hake Report, Devin Reviews, and Earthman Brick, all fighting each other. Well, no, there will be teams. It's going to be a 2v2. All those are posted on our channel. Thank you so much for coming on tonight. Stay tuned for more.